I was 3 years old when my father died. I don't remember him. Not really. There are pictures, grainy, sun-faded snapshots of a man with dark hair and a tired but kind smile. Sometimes, I think I remember his voice, a deep rumble in the background of my earliest memories, but I can't tell if it's real or just something my mind made up to fill the gap. My mother didn't talk about him much. I don't know if it was grief or just survival, but after he was gone, she buried herself in work. She waitressed at a diner, pulling double shifts whenever she could. It was just the two of us in a small, rundown house at the edge of town. We weren't starving, but we were poor. I knew it from the way my mother sighed when she opened bills, from the way she always hesitated before buying anything that wasn't absolutely necessary. Meals were whatever was cheapest. The lights flickered sometimes because we were just a little late paying, but she never let it show too much. When she was home, she smiled, asked about my day, tucked me into bed at night. She was tired, always, but she was there. And then he showed up. His name was Mike. He was just some guy who came into the diner a lot. He was taller than my mother, with broad shoulders and hands that were always a little dirty, like he worked with cars or construction. He had the kind of face that could pass as friendly if he wanted it to be, but there was always something about his eyes that I didn't like, something that made me avoid looking at him for too long. At first, I barely noticed him. He was just another customer. But then he started staying longer, talking to my mom more. And then one day, he was in our house, sitting at our kitchen table like he belonged there. At first, he wasn't bad. Not nice exactly, but not terrible. He made an effort, I guess. He'd ask me about school in a way that felt more like obligation than real curiosity. He was rougher around the edges than my mother, but at least in the beginning he tried. I remember hearing her laugh more when he was around, and I think that's what mattered most to her. She was lonely. She had spent years working and struggling to keep things afloat, and here was this man showing up and paying attention to her. He made her feel like she wasn't alone in it anymore. So, before I knew it, he was in our house all the time. He never officially moved in. I don't think he even had a place of his own. He just stayed, left clothes in the closet, kept a toothbrush in the bathroom, stretched out on the couch like it was his. It just happened, and my mother let it. I didn't like it, but I didn't hate it either. Not yet, because in the beginning, he was just another person in the house. A man who wasn't my father, but wasn't cruel either. That would come later. It started slow. A bad mood here and there, a sharp word when he was tired, a sigh when I did something he didn't like. I remember one night at dinner when I was maybe 9, he watched me push my peas around my plate and just shook his head. "You eat like a girl," he muttered. I didn't know what that meant, but I knew it wasn't a compliment. It wasn't bad, not yet. Just uncomfortable. Like I always had to watch what I said, make sure I wasn't annoying him. But I was a kid, and he was my mother's boyfriend, so I did what kids do. I tried to stay out of his way. But then little by little, things started to shift. The patience wore thin. The little sighs turned into eye rolls. The jokes got sharper. Then he started drinking more. And that's when everything started to fall apart. Mike losing his job was the beginning of the end, though at first, it didn't seem like a disaster. He acted like it was temporary, like he'd find something new in a week or two. "Those bastards were just looking for an excuse to can me," he grumbled, cracking open a beer like it was just another evening. "But I'll be back on my feet in no time." At first, my mother believed him. She wanted to believe him. So when he stopped leaving the house in the mornings, she didn't say much. But as the weeks stretched into months, it became obvious that Mike wasn't looking for work at all. The first real change was his routine, or more accurately, the fact that he no longer had one. Before, he at least kept up the appearance of effort. He'd wake up, drink his coffee, drive off somewhere, come back in the evening with stories about how nobody was hiring good men anymore. But after a while, he stopped even pretending. He started sleeping in later, sometimes past noon. If my mother asked about job applications, he'd get defensive. A man needs a break after years of busting his ass. "Let me breathe." And the drinking got worse. It wasn't just a few beers at dinner anymore. It was morning beers, afternoon beers, hard liquor. Some nights, he'd sit on the couch with a whiskey bottle resting on his stomach, flicking through TV channels like nothing in the world concerned him. The house got worse too. It was never much to begin with, but my mother always kept it clean. She was exhausted from work, but she still wiped the counters, swept the floors, washed the dishes. But the more hours she took at the diner, the less time she had, and Mike sure as hell wasn't going to do anything about it. So the dishes started piling up. The trash sat longer. The air got thick with that stale, unwashed smell, the kind that seeps into fabric and never really leaves. I started doing most of it myself. Not because anyone asked me to, because if I didn't, it wouldn't get done. At first, I thought it was temporary. That Mike would get tired of being a lazy drunk. Then my mother would snap out of it and make him get a job. But months passed. Then a year. And nothing changed. I knew I had to get out. College was my way out. I started saving money when I was 14. At first, it wasn't much birthday money, small amounts. At 15, I did any other job I could find. At 16, I worked after school. I knew no one was going to help me. It was my way out. Until it wasn't. One evening, I came home and saw that almost all of my savings were gone. My stepfather, very drunk, barely had the strength to lie about it. I needed it, he slurred, slumped over the kitchen table. You wouldn't have made it anyway. That night, something in me snapped. I knew then that no one was coming to save me. After high school, I worked any job I could find, shifts in warehouses, at gas stations, night shifts in diners. I had no time to be a kid, no time for friends. Just work, sleep, repeat. And through it all, he was still there, living in my house, eating my food, watching me struggle without a damn ounce of guilt. I didn't say anything to Mike after that night. There was nothing left to say. I worked. I saved. I stopped talking at home altogether. My mother was barely there anymore, always at the diner, always exhausted. Mike was there too much, drinking more than ever, sinking deeper into that couch like he was growing into it. The house was rotting, just like him. Some days, I'd come home and find him passed out in the middle of the floor, an empty bottle tipped over beside him. Other times, he was awake but barely functional, staring blankly at the TV, his hand lazily scratching his stomach, his lips moving like he was talking to someone who wasn't there. And when my mother was home, she was still trying. She still cooked dinner, still asked me how work was going, still tried to act like we were a normal family. But she was tired, and the more she worked, the thinner she got, the heavier the bags under her eyes became. Then, one day, she started coughing. At first, it was nothing, a dry tickle in her throat, something she could brush off with a sip of water and a wave of her hand. But it didn't go away. Weeks passed, and the cough got worse, deeper, harsher. I'd hear it at night, echoing through the walls, rattling her chest like something was breaking inside her. She still went to work, still forced herself to keep going. And then, one night, she came home, sat at the kitchen table, and didn't get back up. I walked in and found her hunched over, her face pale, her breathing shallow. She lifted a weak hand. "I'm fine, baby." But she wasn't. She was sweating, her skin clammy and cold, her breathing wrong in a way that made my stomach twist. I called an ambulance. She fought me on it. Of course she did. But I didn't listen. She was in the hospital for 2 days. And that was when they found it. Cancer. Late stage. The doctors talked in careful, measured voices, using words like treatment and options, but I could see it in their faces. They were just trying to soften the blow. They already knew how this would end. My mother did too. She let me hold her hand while the doctor explained everything. How it had already spread. How they could try chemotherapy, but the chances weren't good. How? At best, she had a year. At worst, a few months. I don't remember walking out of the hospital. I just remember the cold air hitting my face and realizing I couldn't breathe. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I just stood there, staring at the pavement, my ears ringing, my hands shaking. The only person in my life who had ever truly cared about me was dying, and there was nothing I could do. She still went to work. She had no choice. We had no savings, no safety net, no backup plan. So she kept going. She got weaker. She lost weight. The coughing got worse, but she still dragged herself out of bed at dawn, still tied her apron around her waist, and smiled at customers who didn't know she was falling apart. She tried to hide it from me. She didn't want me to worry, didn't want me to see. But I did. I saw the way she moved slower, the way she winced when she stood too fast, the way she gripped the counter like she needed it to hold her up. I begged her to stop. She just smiled at me. "Not yet, baby." She didn't want to die owing anything. Something shifted in Mike. At first, he pretended to care. He tried to be supportive. He made big speeches about how he was going to get back on his feet, find a job, start pulling his weight. But it was all talk. The alcohol had already won. He went out a few times, put in applications, maybe even got an interview or two. but nobody was going to hire him. He showed up to interviews hung over, shaking, barely able to put himself together. So he gave up. He stopped trying, stopped talking about it, and instead, he just drank more. He was already rotting, but now he was decaying faster than ever. He could barely even lift himself off the couch anymore. His hands shook constantly, his face always pale and sweaty, like his body was permanently stuck between sickness and withdrawal. And I hated him more than I ever had before. He was useless, a parasite, a pathetic, broken man who had let himself fall apart while my mother worked herself into the ground. And still, through all of it, she protected him. She never blamed him, never yelled at him. Even when she could barely stand, even when he should have been taking care of her, she still looked at him with pity instead of anger. And I'll never understand that. She deserved better than him. She deserved better than this. She lasted 7 months. I held her hand the night she died. She was in our house, in the bed she had always slept in. She wanted to be home. She didn't want to die in a hospital, surrounded by strangers. Her breathing had been shallow all day, each exhale weaker than the last. And then she was gone, just like that. Gone. I don't remember much after that. People came. The funeral happened. I stood there, numb, shaking hands with people I barely knew, people who pretended like they had been part of her life when I knew damn well they hadn't. And then, a few days later, when the dust settled and the people stopped calling, I realized the house was mine, the only thing she had left me. And Mike was still there. And now I had a choice to make. The house was silent in a way I wasn't used to. Even when my mother was too sick to move, even when her voice had become little more than a whisper, there had still been life here. A presence. Something warm and familiar. Something that made it feel like a home, even when everything else was falling apart. But now it was just walls and a roof. A hollow, empty place that smelled like stale beer and sickness. And Mike was still in it. I don't know why I expected him to leave. Maybe because I thought he'd feel something. Guilt, shame, regret, anything. But he didn't. A week after my mother was gone, he was still sitting in the same spot on the couch, still drinking, still wasting space like nothing had changed. My mother was the only thing tying him to this house. She was the reason I hadn't thrown him out years ago, the reason he still had a roof over his head, the reason he was alive. And now she was gone, and he was still here. I had the power now. The house was mine. It was in my name legally. My mother never married Mike, never put him on the deed, never made him anything more than the man who lived here, which meant I could kick him out whenever I wanted. And he knew it. He avoided me for the first time in his life. Before, he had always been loud. If he wasn't drinking, he was muttering under his breath, making comments, reminding me that he existed in the most irritating ways possible. But now he was quiet. He didn't speak unless he had to. He didn't even look at me most of the time. He just sat there, staring at the walls, drinking like he was waiting for something. And for the first time since I was a kid, he looked small. He was thinner than I remembered. His skin was pale and blotchy. His hands shook when he lifted his bottle, and he moved slower, like every part of him was deteriorating all at once. He looked old. He wasn't, not really. Maybe in his late 50s. But years of drinking had aged him in a way that no amount of time could. And it hit me, suddenly if I threw him out, he would die. Not in a distant, hypothetical way. He would die. Because he had nothing. No job. No money. No friends. No family who gave a shit about him. If I kicked him out, he wouldn't fight me on it. He wouldn't beg, wouldn't argue, wouldn't even ask for a place to stay. He would just walk out the door with whatever he could carry. And then he would drink himself into the ground. I should have been happy about that. I should have wanted him to suffer. He stole from me. Ruined my life. Took every dollar I ever saved, every chance I had to escape. He let my mother die working herself to the bone while he sat there and did nothing. I should have hated him enough to throw him out without a second thought. But I didn't. Because no matter how much I wanted to see him rot, I couldn't stop hearing my mother's voice in my head. She never gave up on him, even when she should have, even when he didn't deserve it. She still made him dinner, still asked if he was feeling okay, still looked at him like he was something more than a waste of a man. And I didn't understand that. I never had. But standing there, looking at him, seeing him for what he really was, a broken, dying man with nowhere to go, I started to. Because maybe that's what made her better than me. Maybe she could see something I couldn't. I clenched my jaw, my fist tightening at my sides. I had a choice to make, and for the first time in my life, I was the one in control. I didn't make my decision right away. I wanted to stand over him, tell him to get his shit and go, watch as he stumbled out the door with nowhere to go and no one to turn to. I wanted him to feel what it was like to have nothing. But I didn't say anything. Not that day. Not the next. Instead, I watched him, not because I cared, not because I was looking for a reason to let him stay. I just wanted to know if he was even capable of trying. For the first time since I was a kid, Mike was sober. Not all the time. He still drank, but not as much. He was running low, and I wasn't buying him more. He didn't ask me to either. I think he knew better. At first, I thought the sobriety might clear his head, that he might get off his ass, start looking for work again, do something, and for a little while it looked like he might. One morning, I found him sitting at the kitchen table, flipping through the classifieds in an old newspaper. I didn't say anything, just stood there, watching him trace the job listings with a shaking finger. He must have felt me staring, because he finally spoke. "I'll be out of here soon." His voice was rough, hoarse from years of drinking and smoking. He didn't look up. "I know you don't want me here." I didn't answer, because he was right. He let out a slow breath, rubbing his eyes. His hand was trembling. "I just need a little time." I wanted to believe him. I really did. But Mike wasn't the kind of man who changed. He tried. I'll give him that. He left the house a few times, went out looking for work. He even got as far as an interview at a warehouse across town. But when he came back that night, I could smell the failure on him. I didn't ask how it went. I didn't have to. Mike couldn't work anymore. Not because he didn't want to, because he physically couldn't. His hands shook too much. His reflexes were too slow. His body was too weak from years of drinking himself into oblivion. He had let himself rot for too long, and now there was nothing left to fix. I think he realized it before I did, because after that he stopped trying, stopped looking for jobs, stopped pretending. And one night, when I came home late from work, I found him sitting on the back steps, a cigarette dangling from his fingers, a half-empty bottle resting beside him. He didn't turn when he heard me. "I know you're going to kick me out." His voice was quiet, almost resigned. "I won't fight you on it." I stepped forward, stopping just a few feet away. He took a slow drag, exhaling smoke into the cold night air. "I don't blame you." I swallowed hard. I wanted to hate him. I wanted to tell him that he had no right to ask me for anything. But he wasn't asking. He was just waiting for me to tell him it was over, that it was time for him to go. And for the first time in my life, Mike looked guilty, like he finally understood what he had done, like he finally realized that this was the end of the road. I clenched my jaw, my fist tightening at my sides. I didn't give him an answer that night. I stood there for a long time, watching the ember of his cigarette glow and fade in the dark, the slow rise and fall of his chest as he stared at nothing. He didn't push me for a response. He just sat there, waiting, like he already knew how this was going to end. I went inside without a word. But I knew I couldn't let him stay here. Not because I wanted to punish him, not because I wanted revenge. I just couldn't look at him anymore. Every time I saw him, pale, shaking, withering on my mother's couch, I felt something crawl under my skin. Something bitter and sharp. Something that made me want to scream at him for wasting his life, for dragging my mother down with him, for taking everything and giving nothing. And yet, I couldn't throw him on the street. I wanted to. I wanted to be the kind of person who could look him in the eye and tell him to get the hell out, to leave him to whatever miserable fate was waiting for him outside these walls. But I wasn't. I hated him, but not enough to let him die. So, I made my decision. The last favor I would ever do for him. I found a place for him 2 days later. It wasn't much, just a one-room unit in a rundown apartment complex across town. But it was cheap, and it was his. I paid the first 2 months' rent, set up a small grocery delivery to be dropped off at his door once a week. Just the basics. Canned food, bread, soup, enough to keep him from starving. Nothing more. I told him in the simplest terms possible. "You're moving out." He didn't argue. He just nodded like he'd been expecting it. I didn't help him pack. He didn't have much anyway. A duffel bag of clothes. A few worthless things he probably didn't even care about. I didn't drive him there. I gave him the address and the keys and told him he had until the end of the day to be out. That was it. When I came home that night, he was gone. And just like that, for the first time in my life, the house was mine. I didn't check in on him. I didn't call. But once a month, I had groceries delivered to his door. I never brought them myself. I didn't want to see him. Didn't want to hear his voice. But I knew he was still there. Because every month, the delivery driver confirmed the food had been taken inside. That was the extent of my contact with Mike. He never reached out. Never asked for anything more. I don't know if he was grateful. I don't know if he even cared. And I don't want to know. I could have let him rot. I could have walked away, wiped my hands of him, let the world swallow him up the way he had let it swallow my mother. But I didn't. Not because he deserved help. Not because I forgave him. Just the simple, stubborn fact that my conscience wouldn't let me throw him out into nothing. And that was enough.